The baths of Caracalla were used for surveillance. Imagine you are stepping into the baths of Caracalla, one of ancient Rome's grandest spectacles of leisure. You walk past soaring columns and mosaic floors so intricate they almost blur into hypnotic patterns. Light filters through massive windows, catching on the swirling steam rising from the caldarium. Everywhere you look, there is evidence of unimaginable wealth and engineering mastery. But what you don't see, the true hidden purpose of these walls might have mattered far more than the luxury you came to enjoy. Because the baths were not merely a place to cleanse the body or display your social standing, they were a stage for surveillance, a vast, echoing theater where the Roman state could listen to your secrets. These baths were commissioned by Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century CE. On the surface, they were an imperial gift to the people, a massive public complex that could hold over 1,600 bathers at once. Inside were hot and cold pools, libraries, gymnasiums, and gardens. The walls were lined with polished marble, and statues of gods loomed over every chamber. But what ordinary citizens did not suspect was that behind those shining surfaces, a network of hollow walls and concealed passages had been quietly constructed. Officials and guards stationed themselves inside these corridors, listening to the conversations that drifted through the heated air. The Roman state had always been wary of subversion. Emperors knew that discontent thrived where citizens gathered to talk freely. In the baths, people felt safe. Relaxed by steam, lulled by luxury, they allowed their tongues to loosen. They debated politics. They gossiped about senators and emperors. They speculated about which legions were loyal, which provinces might rebel. But all the while, their words were seeping into hidden ducts and passing into the ears of men who reported directly to the state. Imagine sitting on the marble bench, wiping sweat from your brow, your voice echoing off the stone. You think you are confiding in a friend, but a shadow behind the wall is making note of every phrase. The baths were built with massive bricks, and between those layers, spaces remained large enough for a man to stand, to shift, to follow the sounds that came through gaps in the masonry. These passageways connected discreetly to maintenance corridors and storage rooms, making it easy for guards to move unseen. There are records fragments of administrative documents and reports describing the baths as a site for gathering intelligence. This practice was part of a broader apparatus of Roman control. The empire had developed an entire culture of surveillance, from informants in taverns to spies embedded in the households of senators. But in the baths of Caracalla, the system reached a new level of sophistication. You could be a merchant, a soldier, a minor bureaucrat, and still be worth watching. Any complaint, any criticism, any hint of disloyalty could be enough to bring the state's scrutiny down on you. The design of the baths made them perfect for this purpose. The ceilings were more than 100 feet high, creating an acoustic chamber, where voices carried far beyond what the speaker intended. Even the arrangement of pools and antechambers encouraged mixing between classes. A senator might bathe beside a craftsman, a foreign envoy beside a local tax collector. This mingling was ideal for gathering rumors and measuring the mood of the people. And while you soaked in the warmth, hidden ears measured you. What's remarkable is that this approach to surveillance was not entirely unique. Other Roman baths had simpler forms of monitoring, but the baths of Caracalla became infamous, perhaps for the scale and intention behind the listening walls. Caracalla himself was a ruler haunted by paranoia. He had his brother Geta murdered in front of their mother. He ordered statues defaced and names erased from inscriptions. And he poured unimaginable resources into building these baths, supposedly as a monument to his generosity. Yet it was also an investment in control. The marble and mosaics were a gilded mask over a system of suspicion. When you think of Roman engineering, you might picture aqueducts or amphitheaters. But these hidden corridors are just as revealing. They show how the empire fused luxury and surveillance into a single experience. Leisure was a tool of loyalty. Comfort was a lure that made you vulnerable. And all the while, the state was listening, measuring, deciding who might be a threat. Consider the psychological effect on citizens, who eventually learned the truth. For some, the baths must have become a place of dread. Imagine returning after hearing that your words had been reported, that something you said in a moment of exhaustion was now an official record. The baths were no longer a sanctuary. They became a reminder that in Rome, Even your private thoughts could be extracted from you without your knowledge. This was not simply an expression of personal paranoia. It was a strategy woven into Roman governance. The state knew that the most dangerous thoughts were those left unspoken in public but whispered in private, and so the walls were built hollow, the corridors hidden, the ears always alert. Even when you felt most at ease stripped of your clothes, immersed in warm water, Rome never let you forget you were subject to its gaze. Modern historians and archaeologists have found evidence that supports these accounts. Excavations of the baths of Caracalla revealed maintenance corridors that had no clear engineering purpose beyond access to the cavities within the walls. Acoustic studies have shown how voices could travel astonishing distances in the vaulted chambers. Inscriptions and records hint at imperial decrees that rewarded those who exposed seditious talk. Though centuries have passed, the ingenuity of Roman surveillance is still visible in the stonework itself. You can walk through the ruins today. You can stand among shattered pillars and cracked mosaics, imagining how they once gleamed under torchlight. But if you look closely, you might see the gaps in the masonry. The concealed doors, the narrow channels where a footstep might have echoed as a guard slipped from one listening point to another. In those empty spaces, you can almost feel the presence of the watchers, their ears pressed to the walls, their silence more powerful than any legion. What is most chilling about the baths of Caracalla is how familiar this all feels, the blending of pleasure and control. The idea that you will surrender your secrets more easily when you are comfortable, when you think you are safe. Modern surveillance has become more sophisticated cameras, algorithms, networks, but the principle is the same. A place that feels like a gift can also be a trap. A space that seems open can be designed to record you. In Rome, the baths were an experiment in this, subtle domination. And the experiment succeeded for as long as the empire stood. As you imagine yourself stepping back through those vast doorways, let this thought stay with you. The baths of Caracalla were a wonder of architecture and engineering. But they were also an instrument of fear, a place where luxury became leverage, where beauty disguised betrayal, and where the whispers of ordinary people were harvested, sifted, and used to shape the fate of an empire that never stopped listening. Temple of Vesta had a hidden Firekeeper rotation. Imagine a small, round temple in the heart of ancient Rome, its marble columns gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. From the outside, the Temple of Vesta looked tranquilla, place of sacred calm, a monument to Rome's unbroken spirit. But step across its threshold, and you would discover a hidden choreography, an unyielding system of vigilance that never allowed the flame of the goddess to falter. This was not just religious duty, it was a burden carried on the shoulders. Of the Vestal virgins, a select group of women who lived between reverence and terror, chosen as children to protect the beating heart of Rome itself. The eternal flame of Vesta was no mere symbol. It was believed to embody the life force of the entire city. If it died, Romans believed, Rome would perish too. For nearly 1,000 years, that fire burned without interruption, but few ever learned how it was truly maintained. It was not enough to rely on piety and routine. Instead, the Vestals practiced an unpublicized ritual rotation, a hidden cycle of guard that never paused, not even when the empire teetered on the brink of collapse. 6 women at any given time were tasked with its care, but it was not simply a collective responsibility. Every 4 hours, around the clock, one of them would take her position by the flame. Dressed in ceremonial linen and crowned with the infula woolen band that bound her hair as a sign she was both sacred and untouchable. The shift was solitary. The others would rest or perform ancillary duties, but whoever kept watch was alone in the circular chamber, her mind locked in a singular focus, that the fire should never, even for an instant, die down. The records we have, scattered across writings by Plutarch, Ovid, and later Christian chroniclers, hint at the precise severity of this discipline. Though the official rituals were celebrated openly parades of garlanded oxen, festivals with musicians and gifts, the internal schedule of flamekeeping remained concealed from the wider populace. Roman citizens imagined a steady, serene flame tended by noble priestesses in quiet harmony. In truth, the vigilance demanded was exhausting. If a Vestal nodded off or failed to replenish the firewood at the right moment, the embers could fade to nothing. And then the consequences were unthinkable. Public disgrace was the first penalty. A Vestal whose inattention led to the extinguishing of the flame was paraded through the streets in humiliation. But more often, that shame escalated to a sentence as brutal as any in Roman law. If it was ruled that she had not simply erred but committed sacrilege through neglect, she could be condemned to death. And because her body was considered sacrosanct, no Roman could legally spill her blood. So the punishment devised was both grim and theatrical. She would be led to a small underground chamber, offered a little food and oil so the Romans could say she was not directly killed, and the door was sealed behind her. She would never be seen again. This was the hidden threat that stalked every hour of every watch, a psychological pressure that bound each Vestal to her duty in a way no public ceremony could reveal. How did such a system emerge? To understand, you have to look back to Rome's earliest centuries, when the line between religion and survival was thin. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, and by extension, of the city's cohesion. Before Rome became an empire, when it was still a collection of tribes fending off invaders, the communal hearth was not just a religious idea, was the literal hearth that kept people warm, cooked their food, and signified the clan's continuity. In those days, a flame going out could mean death from cold or hunger. As the city grew, the symbolism remained. A city that forgot to feed its fire was a city unworthy of destiny. Every candidate for the Order of the Vestals was selected as a young girl, no more than 10 years old. She was taken from her family and given 30 years of service, 10 years to learn the rites, 10 years to practice them, 10 years to teach. For each of these phases, she remained bound to an oath of chastity and to an even stricter oath of vigilance. The rotation of the flame was at the heart of her life, a schedule that overrode all personal rhythms. It was said that the Vestals slept lightly, their dreams half interrupted by the knowledge that the next turn could be theirs. In the dead of night, as Rome lay silent, a single priestess would rise, wrap herself in the vestments, and take her place by the fire. Some Roman writers compared this hidden cycle to the unbroken turning of the stars. As the constellations wheeled overhead, unseen hands fed the fire, keeping Rome's cosmic contract intact. The city's prosperity, the Senate's power, the emperor's legitimacy, all of it depended, at least in the minds of Romans, on this constant guardianship. This is why the punishment for failure was so severe. It was not only a private failing, but an existential threat. The death of a Vestal was a purification, a sacrifice to prevent the goddess's wrath from spreading. There were moments in history when the stakes grew even higher. During the Punic Wars, when Hannibal stood poised to sack Rome, the flame was said to flicker and dim. Panic swept the city. The Pontifex Maximus ordered the most senior Vestal to carry out a triple sacrifice and to relight the flame with a burning glass mirror that focused the sun's rays, proving that no mortal torch but the celestial fire itself could renew Vesta's flame. After the ritual succeeded, Rome held a public feast, declaring that the goddess had forgiven them. But privately, among the Vestals, the knowledge remained. If they failed again, no miracle would save them. Later, when Christianity rose to prominence, the Temple of Vesta became a target of reformers who saw its rites as superstitious relics. But even as emperors began to convert, the flame continued to burn. It was not until 394 AD, when Theodosius I banned pagan practices, that the fire was finally extinguished. For nearly a millennium, it had survived wars, invasions, plagues, and revolutions maintained by an unbroken relay of women whose faces history mostly forgot. If you had stood in that temple during its final days, you might have felt a strange undercurrent. To the Romans, it was as if a vital artery were being cut. The women who tended that flame had done so under a discipline more rigorous than any military watch. They had sacrificed their families, their freedom, and sometimes their lives. Their rotation every 4 hours was never advertised in triumphal speeches or carved into monuments. It was a silent choreography, a hidden devotion that propped up the mythology of Rome's destiny. We often imagine ancient temples as purely serene places, spaces of peace and incense, of soft chants and solemn prayers. But the Temple of Vesta was also a place of unrelenting tension. The penalty for error hung over every hour, and in that burden lay its power. Because the Vestals knew that when the city slept, When senators dreamed of conquest and emperors schemed for power, it was they who kept Rome alive, one log of sacred wood at a time. In the end, perhaps that is what makes their story so haunting. The greatness of Rome was not merely forged in legions and laws, but in the invisible discipline of 6 women who never allowed the flame to die. They rotated in secrecy, in sacrifice, and in fear so that everyone else could believe the empire was eternal. The clean sewers that disposed of corpses, imagine standing on the banks of the Tiber River in ancient Rome. The air is heavy with the damp smell of moss and river silt, and if you looked down into the water, you might see the faint ripple of something being carried away by the current. At first glance, it would seem unremarkable, just debris washed from the city's drains. But if you were living in Rome 2,000 years ago, you might have known a darker possibility. You might have understood that the Cloaca Maxima, greatest sewer of Rome, was more than a marvel of civil engineering. It was also, according to persistent records and accounts whispered in private, a secret channel for the disposal of bodies that no one was meant to remember. The Cloaca Maxima began as a public works project in the 6th century BCE, during the reign of the Etruscan kings who ruled before the Roman Republic. Its original purpose was both practical and impressive: to drain the marshlands between the hills and reclaim the forum as usable ground. Over the centuries, it was expanded, strengthened, and refined. Arches were reinforced with concrete. Channels were lined with carefully cut stone. Water from the hills was directed through a network of conduits, washing away waste and storm runoff. From the perspective of an engineer, it was an astonishing achievement, a subterranean river that kept the swelling capital clean. But Rome was never just a city of stone and law. It was also a city of secrets, intrigue, and invisible power. For the senators who ruled from the Curia Julia, order was maintained not only by visible institutions, but by hidden mechanisms. When the Republic collapsed and the empire rose in its place, that darkness deepened. Political rivalry turned lethal, and executions became a form of governance as much as a display of justice. Official histories record many of these deaths, with ritual solemnity trials, proclamations, public executions in the forum. Yet other fates were not so public. These were the victims whose names never made it onto a plaque or a scroll. They were enemies of powerful men whose erasure had to be total, whose bodies had to disappear without a trace. The historian Cassius Dio wrote that certain deaths were managed quietly. While the Senate might formally condemn a conspirator, the method of removal was left to discretion. Livy's accounts occasionally hint that families were never permitted to claim the remains. Suetonius, though more known for scandalous biographies, suggested that some emperors preferred to have rivals strangled at night and their bodies hidden before dawn. What better place to hide a body than in the Cloaca Maxima, where the flow of water and waste would carry it beyond the city walls and into the Tiber's broad current? No funeral, no grave, no marker. Just a silent disappearance into the underworld of the city itself. We know from archaeological evidence that the Cloaca Maxima was remarkably well maintained. Ancient inspectors worked with teams of slaves and laborers to keep the passageways clear of blockages. The sewers were considered so vital to the health of Rome that they were periodically cleaned, flushed with water, and repaired at great expense. But the same meticulous care that kept the cloaca functioning also made it ideal for disposal. The system was labyrinthine. A body could be inserted far upstream, and by the time it emerged near the river, decomposition and water damage would obscure any identifying marks. In the humid darkness, you would hear nothing but the echo of dripping water and the rush of filth and atmosphere suited perfectly to erasure. One can imagine how it must have been arranged. A senator or a high-ranking official would issue a quiet order. A small group of men, likely trusted guards or hired contractors, would take the condemned into the depths. They might descend a hidden stairway behind an official building or lift a heavy stone grate near a bathhouse. Some historians believe there were concealed access points near the Temple of Vesta and other civic buildings, chosen precisely because they offered privacy. The victim, bound and often gagged, would be led down into the dark, past damp walls, slick with algae. A torch might cast a wavering reflection in ankle-deep water. The sound of the city would vanish behind the curved stone, replaced by a damp, oppressive silence. In those moments before the final act, what thoughts must have passed through the mind of the condemned? Perhaps they realized that no tomb would carry their name, that their children would never be allowed to mourn them. In Roman culture, the rites of burial were essential to the peace of the soul. Denying a body those rites was considered a kind of double punishment. Not only death, but the eternal unrest of a spirit deprived of proper passage to the afterlife. To be disposed of in the cloaca maxima was not just to die it, was to be unmade. Some scholars have argued that this practice was exaggerated over time, that the image of the sewers as an underworld for corpses was a piece of dark legend rather than fact. Yet the consistent recurrence of these stories across centuries suggests there was at least a kernel of truth. Even if it happened only occasionally, the idea took hold in the Roman imagination that beneath the marble temples and sunlit streets, there was an abyss where inconvenient lives could be swallowed without consequence. This duality, the public face of the Cloaca Maxima and its hidden role as a burial ground, captures something essential about Rome itself. The same state that built aqueducts and amphitheaters also perfected the machinery of silent terror. The same society that enshrined the rule of law also made room for extrajudicial killings. And the same city that honored its dead with elaborate monuments also consigned some to an anonymous river of waste. For the Romans, this contradiction was not necessarily a problem to be solved. It was simply reality. Power required purity, but it also required concealment. The Cloaca Maxima was the instrument of both. Over the centuries, the legend of the sewer grew more potent. Medieval chroniclers wrote that ghosts drifted along its tunnels, whispering names that had been stricken from memory. Renaissance antiquarians, excavating parts of the cloaca, claimed to find bones tangled among the silt and pottery shards. Though these discoveries could be explained as ordinary burials disrupted by construction, the stories persisted. The Cloaca Maxima was not merely a sewer, it was a river of oblivion. If you walk the Forum today, you can still see the ancient mouth of the Cloaca Maxima, a massive stone arch half-sunk in the earth. Tourists pass by, cameras raised, never imagining the darkness that once flowed beneath their feet. Yet, in the time of the Caesars, every Roman knew that the cloaca was more than a marvel of engineering. It was a reminder that no amount of stone, no decree of Senate or emperor could fully contain the darkness at the heart of empire. And when the orders came quiet, unsigned, undeniable, the Cloaca Maxima was ready to open its throat and swallow one more secret. This was the hidden undercurrent of Roman power, that it depended not only on visible force, but on invisible disappearance. That for every name etched into triumphal arches, another name was washed into the Tiber and never spoken again. And that sometimes the cleanest systems hide the filthiest truths. Public latrines were places of espionage in the grandeur of ancient Rome, where marble glistened beneath Mediterranean sunlight and senators paraded in flowing togas. There was an unexpected place where power and paranoia converged. It was not the Senate House, nor the columns of the Forum, nor the echoing chambers of imperial villas. It was the latrina, the public latrina communal toilet, that, for all its plainness, became a theater of espionage, confession, and silent betrayal. Imagine walking into one of these latrines. You would find rows of stone seats, perfectly smooth, lined up with deliberate geometry. There were no partitions between you and your neighbor. Privacy was not merely scarce, it was almost non-existent. People sat shoulder to shoulder, their robes gathered around them, chatting as they relieved themselves. For Romans, these spaces were surprisingly social. They discussed politics, gossiped about neighbors, negotiated business deals, and sometimes vented their frustrations about the emperor himself. But hidden behind the polished stone walls were tiny apertures, small, almost invisible holes bored into the masonry. From the other side, an informant could crouch in silence, ear pressed to the opening, straining to catch every careless whisper. The holes were disguised by clever placement or decorative stonework. To the casual eye, they were no more than incidental imperfections, but they served as conduits for intelligence, capturing evidence of seditious speech before it could spread into the streets. Rome's elite understood the power of information. The Emperor Augustus, for example, was known for his extensive spy networks. Later emperors refined these tactics, institutionalizing the practice of delation, the art of denunciation, and A delator could earn both favor and fortune by reporting disloyalty. So while the latrines provided ordinary citizens with sanitation and relief, they also doubled as surveillance chambers. The act of relieving one's body became entangled with the risk of exposing one's mind. One word of mockery about the emperor, one jest about taxation, could become grounds for imprisonment or even execution. In this way, the public latrine embodied a tension at the heart of Roman society. Rome celebrated its ideals of openness and citizenship, yet it demanded conformity enforced by constant observation. The latrines were designed to be clean and efficient, with channels of running water that carried waste away to the sewers. Engineers devised elaborate plumbing systems that rivaled anything else in the ancient world. But what impressed visitors most was how spotless everything appeared. The polished marble, the flowing water, the fresh air, these were testaments to Roman innovation. Yet beneath that immaculate surface was something more insidious, the psychological pressure of never knowing who was listening. Historians have found evidence in legal texts and inscriptions describing prosecutions that began with offhand comments overheard in latrines. Informants could file anonymous accusations, forcing the accused into the grinding machinery of Roman justice. Once accused, even a respected citizen could see their property seized or their family name ruined. It was a silent war waged in the most unassuming place imaginable. Imagine a merchant in the 1st century, exhausted after a day in the marketplace. Sitting down in the latrine beside a fellow citizen, he sighs and murmurs that the emperor's new taxes will starve honest men. He believes he is safe, surrounded by ordinary Romans, but behind the wall, a hidden ear records every syllable. Days later, a tablet arrives, summoning him to account. For treasonous speech, that merchant's fate would be decided by testimony gathered in the shadows. Public latrines became instruments of fear, even as they remained necessary spaces. Everyone used them. Everyone knew that a careless tongue could prove fatal. And so, in Rome, even the most basic human act, relieving oneself, was transformed into a moment of vulnerability. You were never truly alone. You were never truly unobserved. In an empire built on conquest and spectacle, the smallest architectural details could hold the greatest power. A hole in a marble wall could do more to protect the emperor than any legion. And so the latrines endured, spotless and treacherous, a testament to Rome's genius for engineering and its genius for control. This is the hidden history of those pristine communal toilets, a history that reminds us that in Rome, surveillance was not confined to palaces and courts. It thrived in the most unexpected corners, wherever Romans gathered and spoke without thinking that someone might be listening. The marble gleamed, the water flowed, and behind the walls, the empire's watchers waited. Bathhouse ceilings hid secret tunnels. Imagine, you are stepping into the grand expanse of a Roman bathhouse in the 3rd century CE, a place where marble columns gleamed beneath shafts of sunlight filtering through high clerestory windows. The air is thick with the scent of warmed oils and the tang of mineral-rich steam. Voices echo in a vast chamber where hundreds of citizens gathered not merely to cleanse their bodies, but to transact business, form alliances, and trade rumors. Beneath the carefully polished surfaces, something darker moved, something almost no one noticed. Overhead, suspended within the vaulted ceilings. Hidden catwalks and narrow tunnels snaked above the communal pools and heated chambers. These secret passages were designed as maintenance corridors, allowing workers to adjust the hypocaust systems, the intricate networks of pipes and flues that kept the caldarium, tepidarium, and frigidarium at the precise temperatures that Romans considered essential to health and luxury. But over time, these passages evolved into something more, a hidden architecture of surveillance and silent observation that gave select individuals the power to listen without being seen. Imagine the baths of Trajan, completed in 109 CE, or the baths of Caracalla, finished a century later, their ceilings supported by monumental arches that seemed to defy gravity. Behind these arches, spaces barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through were fitted with small openings. Some were designed purely for airflow, part of the ingenious system that ventilated the superheated air rising from the furnaces. But others were intentionally left just wide enough to allow an eye to peer down or an ear to catch the whispers below. Slaves and maintenance crews could watch the gatherings of senators, equestrians, and foreign emissaries. In a world where information was currency, these hidden tunnels became conduits of influence, where a slip of the tongue could ripple outward to the ears of powerful patrons or ambitious rivals. In many cases, the maintenance corridors were staffed by men whose job titles never hinted at their dual purpose. Officially, they were furnace keepers or hydraulic technicians, monitoring the flow of water and the distribution of heat. Unofficially, they were informants recruited by imperial agents or powerful senatorial factions. Historians have found inscriptions referencing the speculators, a term usually applied to scouts and spies in the Roman military, but also used more discreetly in civilian settings. It is believed that some speculators were assigned to bathhouse duty precisely because these grand public spaces provided the perfect cover. No one questioned the constant presence of workers, maintaining the roaring furnaces or clearing sediment from cisterns, while respectable citizens below shared news of grain shipments, political scandals, or border uprisings. The watchers above took note. The architectural ingenuity of Roman bathhouses made this form of surveillance unusually effective. The vaulted ceilings were not only masterpieces of engineering, but also excellent amplifiers of sound. A whisper could carry surprisingly far when it bounced off the smooth plaster or travertine surfaces. Some tunnels even had hidden small, perforated screens set into ornamental panels. From the floor, they looked like innocuous vents. From within the passage, they functioned as listening stations. Certain bathhouses, including regional complexes in Ostia and Pompeii, show evidence of such concealed features. In Ostia Antica's baths of Neptune, for example, fragments of perforated ceramic tiles were discovered during excavations, suggesting a secondary purpose beyond ventilation. Consider the psychological effect on the people below if they had known bathhouses were sanctuaries where men and women believed they were free from scrutiny, immersed in ritual purification and leisurely conversation. To discover that their most casual comments were recorded by hidden witnesses would have been an existential violation. Yet, for the Roman state, the logic was brutally simple. Information was the bloodstream of empire. If you controlled what people dared to say, you controlled what they dared to think. Stories have survived of political careers ruined by indiscretions whispered in a steam-filled chamber. In one account preserved in the letters of Pliny the Younger, a minor official was stripped of his rank after boasting of a plan to siphon funds meant for public works. Though Pliny doesn't name the bathhouse, scholars have speculated that it was the Baths of Titus, notorious even then as a place where informants blended invisibly into the workforce. Another tale, this one more ominous, tells of a senator who was found drowned in the caldarium, but some believed he had been silenced after a watcher overheard treasonous plotting. What makes this phenomenon so compelling is not only the cold pragmatism of the Roman elite, but the seamless integration of surveillance into the architecture itself. Nothing was added later as an afterthought. From the first drafts on parchment to the final construction, these passageways were part of the plan. The same builders who created the elegant mosaics and colossal vaults also engineered the catwalks. The same masons who carved the decorative reliefs shaped the hidden grills. And the same architects who laid out the symmetria, the perfect mathematical proportions ensured that maintenance workers could slip unseen between chambers. It is easy to imagine one of these watchers, a young slave crouched behind a vent, in the ceiling, barely daring to breathe as the voices of Rome's powerful drifted up to him. Maybe he scribbled notes on a wax tablet. Maybe he merely listened, the details committed to memory until he could report to his handler. Perhaps he even felt a pang of guilt, knowing that what he heard could destroy reputations or end lives. Yet for all his fear, he remained in the tunnel, because in Rome there was no higher law than duty to your patron, and no swifter punishment than failure to serve. Even as the empire declined and the great bathhouses fell into partial ruin, these passages lingered. Medieval travelers who picked through the remains of the baths of Caracalla described narrow corridors lined with soot and collapsed bricks. They had no idea that centuries earlier, men had used them to eavesdrop on the empire's secrets. When archaeologists finally began systematic excavations, they realized how intricate the tunnel systems were, like a nervous system running behind the skin of the bathhouse. Today, when you walk through the ruins, you can still see the evidence. The scorched walls where furnaces once roared, the slender cavities between vaults, the remains of small grates designed to look harmless. You might even feel the strange awareness that you are being observed, though no eyes remain to watch you. This is the legacy of an empire that believed control was best exerted invisibly, that a word overheard was more powerful than a legion of soldiers. In these bathhouses, privacy was always an illusion. Clean marble and shimmering pools concealed a truth more uncomfortable than any stain. The Romans understood that no one speaks more honestly than when they believe. No one is listening, and so they built their walls to listen, their ceilings to watch, and their tunnels to carry secrets through the darkness, until the day those secrets emerged to shape the fate of an empire. The Library of Celsus contained hidden chambers. Imagine approaching the grand marble steps of the Library of Celsus in the Roman city of Ephesus. The sun glances off the towering columns and elaborately carved pediments, a spectacle designed to proclaim the glory of learning to every visitor. You see a facade so perfectly proportioned, it almost feels theatrical. Tall statues of wisdom, virtue, knowledge, and intelligence gaze serenely over the entrance, as if nothing could exist here but the noble pursuit of truth. But what you would never guess from standing in that bright courtyard is that this library was not simply a monument to scholarship. It was also a labyrinth of hidden spaces, sealed chambers, and secret purposes that still remain partly unexplained. The Library of Celsus was completed in the early 2nd century CE, built as a mausoleum for Tiberius Julius Celsus Palaeminus, a Roman senator and proconsul of Asia. His son commissioned it both as a tomb and a public library, an act of filial piety and civic generosity. On the surface, it was an unambiguous gift to the city housing, thousands of scrolls and serving as a beacon of Roman culture in one of the wealthiest provinces of the empire. But the deeper you study its architecture and the sparse records left behind, the more you begin to suspect that this library was never just about public knowledge. Look at the building's layout. Behind the facade was a main reading room, a rectangular chamber with a high vaulted ceiling and niches along the walls. These niches held wooden cabinets containing scrolls, carefully catalogued and stored in conditions designed to protect them from moisture and insects. But early excavations revealed that the library also contained a network of small rear rooms accessible only through narrow corridor spaces that were sealed off or disguised behind masonry. These chambers were not included in the grand design, meant to impress visitors. They were deliberately hidden, suggesting that their contents or their activities were not for general eyes. Scholars have speculated for decades about what lay within. One possibility is that these hidden rooms were used to store texts considered too controversial or dangerous for public circulation. The Roman Empire tolerated a remarkable range of philosophies, but it also feared the power of ideas to incite. Dissent-banned works might be quietly removed from public access and placed in secure archives. It was a way to preserve them without allowing their influence to spread a compromise between censorship and cultural memory. Certain religious texts, politically subversive manifestos, or treatises on magic and astrology could have been hidden in these chambers, consulted only by trusted officials or elite scholars with special permission. Another possibility is that the chambers were used for private meetings. In the Roman world, libraries were not merely places to read, they were centers of intellectual patronage and influence. Wealthy patrons, administrators, and philosophers often used them to conduct business discreetly. The sealed rear rooms of the Library of Celsus would have provided an ideal setting isolated from the crowds, insulated by thick stone walls. Here, alliances could be negotiated, patronage arranged, or philosophical schools could debate in secret without fear of interruption. Imagine for a moment what it would have felt like to step through the main hall. The air scented faintly with old papyrus and wax. A trusted attendant might draw aside a curtain or unlatch a hidden door. You would slip through into a much smaller space lit by a single oil lamp, with shelves containing scrolls you are not meant to see. Perhaps you would unroll a text that had been officially suppressed. Reading by flickering light, while voices murmured just beyond the walls. Outside, the public might gather to admire the marble statues and admire the virtues they symbolized. Inside, knowledge was being negotiated in ways no official inscription would ever record. Archaeological evidence supports these theories. Fragments of walls show clear signs of later modifications. Passageways bricked up, chambers reinforced. Some sections of the library were deliberately sealed in late antiquity, possibly to protect their contents or simply to erase the memory of what had been stored there. Other signs hint that in later centuries, the chambers may have been used for purposes even more mysterious. During periods of religious conflict, Christian and pagan authorities both sought to control which books survived and which were destroyed. The hidden rooms may have become a vault for texts deemed heretical by one faction or another. This layered history of concealment gives the Library of Celsus a quality that is almost paradoxical. It was one of the most public buildings of its Tema library, whose facade was intended to proclaim transparency and enlightenment. And yet, it was also a building designed to keep secrets. The facade itself was a mask, a performance of cultural legitimacy that concealed the quiet battles being fought over knowledge and power behind it. Today, when you visit the ruins, you see only the shell of that grand vision. The main hall is open to the sky, its roof long since collapsed. The statues are replicas. The scrolls themselves are gone, their contents scattered or lost to time. But the sealed chambers remain a tantalizing mystery. What was so important or so dangerous that it had to be hidden behind stone and darkness? What ideas were debated there that could not be shared in the open? This is the legacy of the Library of Celsus, not just a monument to Roman architecture, but a reminder that knowledge has always existed in tension with authority. Every culture that claims to honor learning also fears what learning can do. Every library is both a treasure house and a battleground. And sometimes, the most important truths are the ones that have to be hidden away in silence, waiting for a moment when the world is finally ready to face them. Aqueducts carried messages as well as water. When most people imagine the Roman aqueducts, they think of pure engineering mastery, arches soaring across valleys, channels carrying clean water to thirsty cities, and the relentless ambition of an empire determined to bend nature to its will. But there was another layer to these graceful structures, a hidden purpose that few suspected. The aqueduct towers, those modest-looking inspection and access points dotting the channels, sometimes served as silent couriers of Rome's most sensitive messages. This is the story of how stone, water, and secrecy converged in the Roman world. Picture an aqueduct tower rising from the fields of Gaul, its weathered walls catching the dawn light. To the local villagers, it was simply a structure for controlling the flow, regulating pressure, and providing maintenance access. But inside, the Romans had left space an interior shaft that appeared to be only for drainage or overflow. In reality, it became a perfect hiding place for communication that could not risk interception by couriers on the road. Roman administrators understood the value of speed and discretion. Messages sent by horseback could be delayed or stolen. In troubled provinces, couriers might vanish altogether. But the aqueducts were less obvious. A message hidden in the drainage shaft of a tower could remain there for days or weeks, waiting for the right person to retrieve it. And so, in the late 1st century, a tower collapsed in Gaul after a season of relentless rain and shifting ground. Local laborers, summoned to clear the debris, expected to find broken tiles and shattered stone. Instead, they uncovered scrolls tucked deep within the wreckage, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture. The scrolls were coded, their text meaningless to anyone without the key. Though historians debate exactly what they contained, the prevailing theory is that these were administrative reports lists of taxes collected, grain shipments delayed, and possibly intelligence on local unrest. To Roman officials, information was power, and the aqueduct towers provided a discreet repository that no casual traveler would suspect. The Roman aqueduct system was the envy of the ancient world. Dozens of aqueducts funneled water to cities across the empire, maintaining the baths, fountains, and latrines that defined Roman life. The engineering was precise. Each channel had a gentle slope, descending by fractions of an inch per 100 feet to keep water moving. Towers punctuated the line wherever terrain dipped or the gradient needed adjustment. Most were simple structure stall, narrow, open to the air. But in the more remote provinces, where rebellion simmered just beneath the surface, some towers were modified with concealed compartments or hollow walls. Soldiers and officials could climb the narrow staircases, check the flow of water, and unseen by anyone in the valley below, leave behind messages in containers sealed against the damp. It was a system that relied on discipline, engineering, and the unshakable belief that Rome had a right to know everything. In that sense, aqueduct towers were extensions of Roman dominion as much as the roads and fortresses. They were nodes in a web of control spun across thousands of miles. The discovery in Gaul was remarkable, but not entirely unique. In fragments of legal correspondence and provincial reports, there are references to messages being relayed via stations of water, a phrase that has puzzled historians for centuries. Combined with the Gaul Tower collapse, these fragments suggest that the aqueduct network was more than infrastructure. It was an invisible courier service for a ruling class determined to anticipate sedition before it erupted. Think of the implications. For an empire stretched thin, the governor of a distant province could dispatch orders without relying on uncertain messengers. A military commander could inform Rome of troop movements without the risk of intercepted letters. Even tax collectors could report shortfalls discreetly, buying time to correct problems before they were exposed in the forum. But this clandestine system also reveals a paradox. Rome was mighty, but it was never truly secure. The more territory it conquered, the more it feared rebellion. The aqueducts that kept cities alive also became arteries of fear channels, not just for water, but for intelligence and control. The collapse of the tower in Gaul offers a glimpse into that hidden reality. For decades, villagers had walked past it, never imagining that beneath the smooth stone, coded messages waited in the darkness. When the scrolls came to light, they exposed the fragile balance Rome maintained. An empire that could build aqueducts across mountains and valleys still relied on secrecy to hold itself together. Today, the remnants of those aqueducts still stand, their arches graceful against the sky. Most visitors admire their scale and beauty without suspecting how many secrets once flowed within their walls. The stones are silent now, the messages long, unreadable. But if you stand in the shade of a crumbling tower and listen carefully, you might sense the echo of whispered plans, of coded instructions hidden from all but the initiated. In Rome, nothing was ever only what it appeared to be. A tower was never merely a tower, and water was never only water. Clean temples hid bloody political deals. If you stood at dawn before the colossal steps of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on Rome's Capitoline Hill, you might have believed you were approaching the heart of something incorruptible. Sunlight caught the bright marble columns, the gold-capped roof tiles gleamed, and the air seemed to vibrate with solemn authority. This was the seat of the chief god of Rome, where sacrifices were made to secure the favor of the heavens. Every procession, every vow, every ritual appeared to elevate the city above the frailties of human ambition. But hidden behind those gleaming walls, among the chambers that ordinary Romans never glimpsed, darker pacts were sealed pacts that shaped the Republic's destiny far more than any oracle or augure's reading. Imagine passing through the great bronze doors and stepping into the shadowed interior. Torches burned in sconces along walls of painted terracotta reliefs that depicted Jupiter hurling thunderbolts at enemies of the state. On festival days, the sanctuary filled with priests in immaculate white togas, chanting hymns that echoed among the vast columns. But when the ceremonies ended and the crowds departed, powerful men slipped back inside. They convened in the dim side rooms where statues loomed overhead, silent witnesses to ambition. Historical accounts and inscriptions suggest that temples were among the safest places in Rome. To discuss schemes that could never be spoken aloud in the forum were practical as well as psychological. First, temples were considered inviolable, protected by religious law. Their sanctity discouraged sudden raids by rivals or the intervention of soldiers. Second, the hush of the interior punctuated only by the crackle of the sacred flame, or the soft sweep of a priest's sandals was the perfect cover for low, urgent voices. Finally, any person who met here could claim, if challenged, that he was only fulfilling a vow to the gods. In the Temple of Jupiter itself, the archives were housed inside chambers, treaties with foreign kings, senatorial decrees, and records of military triumphs, but nearby were hidden spaces where senators and generals conducted business far removed from official parchment. During the late Republic, when the competition for power grew savage, bribes were arranged here as smoothly as religious ceremonies. Money changed hands in purses, sealed with wax sigils. The men who carried these bribes, usually slaves or freedmen, were trained never to speak of what they delivered. Consider the case of Lucius Sergius Catilina, better known as Cat. He is most famous for plotting to overthrow the Republic in 63 BCE, but before his conspiracy erupted into open scandal. Catiline spent years forging secret alliances inside temples, including Jupiter's. In the shadows of columns whose capitals soared nearly 60 feet above the floor, he and his supporters whispered about debts, promises of office, and what price would convince a rival to look away. Roman historians such as Sallust describe how certain temples doubled as places to secure assassinations. Quiet agreements that began with an exchange of coin and ended with a body in a back alley. It is not an exaggeration to say that, under the painted gaze of Jupiter, men decided who would live and who would vanish. The irony was not lost even on Romans themselves that the god meant to guard the city's morality presided over meetings that would horrify the common citizen. The phenomenon was not unique to Rome's greatest temple. The Temple of Concord, built to commemorate civic harmony, was notorious for private deals that bred exactly the opposite. Cicero himself mentions how votes were bought and sold in its porticos, where the cool shade offered a discreet place to finalize arrangements. The Temple of Castor and Pollux, originally erected to honor twin gods of military victory, became a place for wealthy equestrians to broker contracts and manipulate grain prices. And the Temple of Ops, goddess of abundance, sometimes functioned as a vault, where bribe money was stored behind locked doors. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations have uncovered small side rooms in temples that had no clear ritual purpose. Their only function seems to have been to provide a space apart from the main sanctuary's rooms that could be closed off by heavy wooden doors. Graffiti scratched into the plaster of these hidden chambers records names, symbols, and sums of money. Though scholars debate whether all of them refer to bribes, the patterns are unmistakable. Names of powerful men, repeated alongside amounts large enough to sway elections or command mercenaries. Imagine the psychology of these men, to conduct betrayal or to authorize murder beneath the very images of gods, demanded a peculiar kind of self-justification. Perhaps they believed that their ambitions were divinely sanctioned. Perhaps the sanctity of the temple offered them a sense of absolution. Or perhaps it simply reinforced the illusion that in Rome, power itself was the highest faith, and any god who presided over it must surely approve. What makes these episodes all the more haunting is the atmosphere in which they unfolded. The air smelled of incense and burning offerings. Every surface glimmered with votive gifts, golden wreaths, silver plaques, carved ivory. In that charged environment, conspirators might feel as though they were not merely plotting for their own advancement, but participating in a destiny grander than themselves. It was this potent mixture of reverence and ruthlessness that allowed temples to become theaters of political survival. Even centuries later, when Rome's empire was ruled by emperors rather than the Senate, the old temples continued to shelter hidden intrigues. The imperial cult temples, dedicated to deified Caesars, were used as secret meeting places for provincial governors and military commanders. Cassius Dio recounts how, under the guise of offering sacrifice to Augustus, generals discussed the loyalty of legions and the possibility of rebellion. When Constantine eventually embraced Christianity, the pagan temples lost much of their official power, but the architecture of conspiracy persisted. Today, when you walk among the ruins of the Capitoline Hill or peer through the reconstructed columns of the Temple of Jupiter, it is tempting to imagine only solemn rituals and public piety. The tourist gaze glides over fragments of marble without grasping what those walls heard: oaths that corrupted bargains, that unmade alliances, orders that cost men their lives. If you stand very still, you might almost sense the tension of centuries of whispered bargains clinging to the stones. This hidden history reminds us that power thrives in shadows, even beneath the brightest altars. Rome's temples were not simply monuments to faith, they were sanctuaries where human ambition wrapped itself in the cloak of sanctity. They were proof that no space, however sacred it may appear, can remain free from the impulses that drive men to dominate and destroy. The next time you see a grand temple rising above its city, remember that its clean facades may conceal a record far more bloody and complex than any priest would dare to confess. The Forum's porticos had whispering walls. Imagine yourself standing in the Roman Forum on a bright afternoon. The marble flagstones warm beneath your sandals. All around you rise the architectural trophies of an empire triumphal arches, proclaiming victory, the imposing basilicas where legal disputes were settled, and the porticos lining the Forum's edges like elegant colonnaded arms. The Forum was not only the heart of Roman public life, but a place where power, commerce, and rumor collided in the open air. But what most passers-by never realized was that some of these stately porticos were designed with a hidden purpose. Within the graceful colonnades, certain walls had acoustic properties, so precise that a voice spoken in a hush could travel cleanly along the stone and reach another pair of ears dozens of feet away. They were, in effect, whispering wall conspirators that helped senators share secrets in plain sight. At first glance, this idea sounds almost too ingenious to believe, but if you study the detailed accounts of Roman engineering, you'll find that their architects were masters of manipulating space and sound. The same civilization that perfected the amphitheater where a whisper on the stage could reach the back, understood how to bend acoustics to subtler ends. These whispering walls, or parietes susurrantes, relied on the same principle: carefully curved masonry, hard reflective surfaces, and proportioned vaults that funneled sound along specific paths. The portico of the Basilica Aemilia, for example, was more than a shaded arcade for merchants. Contemporary descriptions suggest it contained niches and concave sections where a speaker could position themselves. Speaking in the quietest voice, the sound would travel along the curvature and emerge distinctly at another niche further down the colonnade. Anyone not precisely standing in the acoustic path would hear nothing but the wind rustling the awnings. It was a perfect arrangement. For senators and magistrates who needed to communicate without risking eavesdropping by servants, petitioners, or rival factions milling about the Forum. Imagine the scene. A senator arrives, draped in his toga, his expression composed, giving no sign of the urgency that has brought him here. He walks the length of the portico, nodding to acquaintances, exchanging a few public pleasantries. Then, without breaking stride, he pauses near a section of wall designed to carry sound. He leans almost casually toward the masonry, lips barely moving, and speaks. 30 feet away, another man stands with one hand resting on a column, apparently studying the carved frieze. But he is listening, straining to catch every word as it threads invisibly through the air. This was Roman politics, a dance of visibility and concealment, where even architecture itself became a tool of intrigue. The use of whispering walls wasn't limited to the Forum. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, describes similar acoustic tricks in villas and baths where patrons could conduct private conversations. But nowhere was the practice as politically charged as in the Forum. For the senators who controlled the state, secrecy was a currency more valuable than coin. When stakes involved prosecutions, alliances, or the delicate maneuvering that determined who rose and who fell, it was worth investing in structures that could protect a confidence. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of these specialized acoustics. Some surviving sections of the porticos show careful shaping of vaults and curved niches. While erosion has softened their precision over to millennia, modern acoustics have demonstrated how concave walls can focus and transmit even a whisper. Imagine standing there in the 1st century CE, how uncanny it must have felt to hear a voice as clear as if it were murmured right behind your shoulder. When the speaker stood nowhere in sight, what makes this all the more fascinating is that the Roman public likely suspected very little. To the average citizen, the Forum's porticos were simply places to meet clients, browse market stalls, or escape the summer sun. Few would have guessed that as they strolled past, a senator's quiet instructions were sliding invisibly along the wall's orders that might influence a vote, a prosecution, or the fate of an entire province. This is what made Roman politics so formidable, a blend of open ceremony and hidden manipulation, all supported by the empire's unmatched command of engineering. In some ways, the whispering walls of the Forum stand as a metaphor for Roman civilization itself. The Romans took enormous pride in the visibility of their institutions. They staged public debates, published laws on bronze tablets, and built monuments to ensure that their achievements could never be forgotten. Yet beneath all this transparency lay a constant current of private maneuvering in scene deals, discreet threats, silent agreements made in the shadows of grand architecture. Over the centuries, the Forum became a palimpsest of power. Emperors rose and fell, fires raged and were rebuilt. Marble facades crumbled and were replaced. But the structures themselves retained their secrets. Even today, when you walk among the ruins, you can trace the outlines of those porticos, the gentle curves of the surviving walls. If you stand very still, you can almost imagine the sound of a voice skimming across the stone proof that in Rome, nothing was ever entirely public and nothing entirely private. This legacy lingers. Modern scholars and architects continue to study how the Romans perfected these acoustic marvels. What began as a practical mastery of sound became a subtle instrument of control. In the Forum, everything was on display, yet, just out of earshot, everything was hidden. The whispering walls remind us that history is not only written in what people declared openly, but also in what they were determined to conceal. And sometimes, the greatest truths were never shouted at all, they were murmured, carried on a thread of sound, and then swallowed by the unremarkable curve of a portico wall. Elite homes used secret water channels for poison disposal. Imagine stepping through the marble threshold of a grand domos in ancient Rome. The polished floor gleams beneath the flickering lamplight. You see the patterned mosaics depicting triumphal chariots or scenes from Homer. Above you, a soaring atrium opens to the sky, catching the rain in the central impluvium. The air smells faintly of wine, warm bread, and perfumed oil. On the surface, this is a home of refinement and hospitality, a place where senators and aristocrats gather to share meals, recite poetry, and conduct affairs of state in a setting that radiates wealth and civilization. But hidden beneath that elegance lay a darker reality, a system of secret water channels, engineered to carry away the residue of carefully administered poisons, so that death itself could be tidied up and flushed from view before dawn. Historians have long known that political killings were an accepted, even expected part of elite Roman life. For the men who vied for power, ambition was a lethal sport. Alliances shifted like sand underfoot. Rivalries often ended not with an open accusation in the Senate, but with a discreet cup passed at the banquet table. The more refined the occasion appeared on the surface, the more likely it was that treachery would be unfolding behind the scenes. Pliny the Elder recorded that certain households had perfected the art of poisoning, so much so that entire dynasties fell to a single evening's entertainment. Yet what is less known and more chilling is how carefully the evidence of those crimes was managed. Beneath the grand atriums of Rome's noble homes ran drainage, networks so meticulously constructed that they could rival the engineering of public baths or temples. On the record, these channels served the innocuous purpose of draining rainwater and kitchen waste. But inscriptions and architectural remains have revealed that in certain households, the drains were more sophisticated than practicality alone demanded. They were fitted with small sluiceways and branching pipes that could be discreetly opened or sealed. Some even had dedicated conduits leading away from the main sewer line. These channels allowed servants to pour away the dregs of poisoned cups, wash contaminated plates, and rinse hands stained by deadly substances, all residue lingering where it could arouse suspicion. Imagine how such a system would have worked on an evening when a guest was marked for death. The victim would arrive in formal dress, greeted by the paterfamilias with a courteous embrace. Slaves would bring perfumed towels, pour the first rounds of diluted wine. As the meal unfolded, one elaborate course after another conversation might drift to politics, philosophy, or military campaigns. All the while, an undercurrent of calculation threaded through every word. At some invisible signal, a servant might approach carrying a cup that looked no different from any other. Perhaps it contained a wine mixed with powdered aconite or hemlock, or with a subtler toxin derived from imported herbs. The guest would lift the cup, toast his host, and drink. Minutes later, as the victim's pulse slowed and the color drained from his face, the host would affect shock, ordering the man carried from the dining couch. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the operation of concealment began. The cup and any remaining traces were whisked to a service corridor. There, a trusted slave or freedman would rinse the vessel over a specially prepared drain, one that diverted the poisonous runoff into a secondary channel sealed from the main household plumbing. That fluid might pass through narrow terracotta pipes and ultimately empty into a subterranean cistern, where it mixed with other waste impossible to trace once diluted. When authorities later investigated, they would find no residue in the atrium's visible drains and no telltale stains around the kitchen basins. The existence of these poison disposal systems was hinted at by Roman writers, who described them obliquely, careful never to name names outright. Tacitus alludes to noble families whose kitchens were built with more complexity than necessity. Juvenal, in one of his savage satires, ridicules the hypocrisy of hosts, who claimed moral superiority while their drains ran dark with the evidence of their crimes. Even Seneca, in his philosophical writings, acknowledged that the homes of the powerful were designed as much for secrecy as for display. He wrote that the threshold of greatness is swept clean of footprints. An observation that could be read literally every trace of wrongdoing was meant to vanish as if it had never existed. Archaeological excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum have confirmed that Roman houses often contained complex networks of piping, far beyond what was strictly necessary for hygiene. In some domas, archaeologists discovered narrow lead conduits leading from kitchen service areas to sealed drainage pits, unconnected to public sewers. The layout suggests deliberate separation waste meant to be hidden, either for reasons of privacy or, more darkly, to ensure that anything incriminating could never be retrieved. While the Roman legal system did prosecute poisoning in theory, in practice, the wealthy rarely faced consequences unless political winds turned decisively against them. A family that could afford such engineered concealment also had the means to silence accusers and bribe officials to look the other way. This union of engineering brilliance and moral corruption is part of what makes Roman history so haunting. These were people who could build aqueducts that spanned miles, who could pave roads across continents, who could raise temples that still stand 2,000 years later. Yet they also used that same ingenuity to perfect the art of invisible murder. Every channel, every tile, every hidden sluice was a testament to how deeply the Romans believed that power meant controlling not only appearances, but evidence itself. Imagine yourself as a guest who survived such an evening. Perhaps you sensed the undercurrents, but were spared for now. As you stepped across the polished floor, did you notice the faint gleam of water pooling at the edge of the impluvium? Did you wonder where that water went, what secrets it carried below? Did you feel the chill of knowing that beneath your feet, the house itself was built to swallow any trace of dissent or betrayal? This was the reality of elite Roman households. They were more than homes. They were machines designed to project authority and conceal guilt in equal measure. The atriums glittered with light and luxury, while just below, dark channels waited to erase any evidence that power had been defended by poison. Even now, when we walk through the remains of those great houses, we are reminded that history is not always written in the monuments left standing above ground. Sometimes it is hidden in the pipes that drained the sins of empire into darkness. The Romans understood that the appearance of virtue was as essential as virtue itself, and they were willing to engineer entire networks of secrecy to preserve it. These channels were not accidents of construction. They were deliberate, refined, over generations, built to serve families who knew that in the world of Roman politics, survival often required the clean disposal of dirty deeds. And so, beneath the elegance and the ceremony, there ran an invisible river, silent witness, to the lengths to which ambition will go when it decides that nothing, not even a human life, should stand in its way. The Pantheon concealed astronomical rituals. If you have ever stood in the middle of the Pantheon in Rome, you have felt the hush that falls when your eyes lift toward the oculus. That perfect circular opening, 27 feet wide, seems almost too precise to be an accidenta hole punched through the dome, not by human hands, but by some cosmic intention. Light streams down in a single, unwavering column, cutting through the gloom of the cavernous rotunda. Tourists tilt their heads back and watch the dust motes swirl in the beam. They see beauty, they see engineering brilliance. What they do not see is how this beam was once a weapon of ritual, a silent instrument that turned architecture into an observatory and a theater of secret ceremonies. The Pantheon was commissioned by Marcus Agrippa around 27 BCE, but the building as we see it today was completed under Emperor Hadrian around 126 CE. It was dedicated to all the gods, an inclusive gesture that disguised a far more intricate purpose. The Pantheon was not just a temple, it was a map of the heavens anchored to the earth. The Great Dome, which remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, is coffered with recessed panels that form concentric rings, a pattern that scholars believe symbolized the celestial spheres. But it was the oculus itself that transformed the building into a cosmic clock. High priests of Rome's state religion, the pontifices, learned to observe the way the light shifted hour by hour, season by season. Each day, the sun's angle was different, and its rays fell on different niches and statues arranged around the perimeter. From dawn to dusk, the beam crept slowly across the marble floor, illuminating altars, inscriptions, and sacred effigies of the gods. But there were specific days, solstices, equinoxes, and imperial anniversaries, when the light aligned with unsettling precision. Imagine standing near the Western Wall on the 21st of April, the traditional date of Rome's founding. As the morning advanced, the sunbeam rose until it struck the entrance, flooding it with golden radiance. To the people assembled below, it seemed as if the gods themselves had opened a door of fire to bless the city's birth. Ancient accounts describe how priests in spotless white robes would step into the light at that moment, their faces lit, with a glow so dazzling that it blurred the line between human and divine. To the uninitiated, it looked like a miracle. To the men who controlled the ritual calendar, it was the culmination of meticulous planning. Scholars have discovered that the Pantheon's alignment was no accident. The building's orientation northwest, rather than due northwest, chosen to create these calendrical effects. The oculus served as a fixed aperture through which the entire sky rotated by noting which statue the beam touched first on a given morning. Priests could track the progression of the seasons. In an era without mechanical clocks precise enough to chart celestial time, the Pantheon was a stone instrument of cosmic measurement. There are suggestions in ancient sources that some rituals were timed to these alignments, not for the sake of spectacle, but for political power. When an emperor wished to associate himself with Jupiter or Apollo, ceremonies were scheduled so that the light would sanctify his likeness. A statue of Augustus, placed in a particular niche, would blaze with sudden brilliance as the sun struck. It's an event carefully interpreted by the priests as divine favor. The symbolism was unmistakable. The emperor was not merely endorsed by the gods, but bathed in their light. Consider how this manipulation of architecture and astronomy worked. On the human psyche, to stand in the Pantheon and witness the sunbeam igniting a statue was to feel, even for a moment, that the universe itself had chosen your ruler. This was not the cold observation of an astronomer charting stars on parchment. This was a living drama unfolding in real time, designed to bind the crowd's loyalty to power. The priests alone understood the mechanics behind the wonder. They alone knew how the seasons and the angles conspired to create the illusion. But they did not share their knowledge. Knowledge was control, and control was the essence of Rome's religious machinery. Beyond the imperial cult, the Pantheon also served as a locus for rituals marking solstices and equinoxes, moments when the balance of day and night shifted. Roman religion was obsessed with these thresholds, believing that the veil between the mortal and divine thinned at such times. The building's architecture was an instrument for navigating that invisible boundary. During the summer solstice, the noon sun fell directly into the oculus and struck the floor in the exact center of the rotunda symbolic union of sky and earth. Priests would scatter offerings, grains, herbs, and tiny figurines into the circle of light as part of purification rites. Only they knew the secret rhythm of the days when these rituals were most potent. Archaeological evidence offers tantalizing clues, where patterns on the marble floor suggest repeated processions along the same paths, with congregants circling the illuminated center in slow, deliberate steps. Traces of burnt incense and resin have been found in the joints between paving stones. These residues are the fingerprints of ceremonies that no text fully describes, rites whose meanings were guarded by an elite priesthood, never intended for public comprehension. The Pantheon's dome is often compared to the vault of heaven, but to the Romans, who understood its hidden design, It was also a clock without hands, marking time through shadow and brilliance. The rituals conducted here were performances of cosmic order. They told the people that Rome was not merely a city on the Tiber, but the appointed heart of the universe, a place where the light of the gods descended on schedule, sanctifying the empire's ambitions. Even after the fall of paganism, the building's celestial functions lingered in memory. Early Christian writers marveled at the oculus, but did not fully grasp its purpose. Medieval pilgrims called it the Eye of Heaven, unaware that it had once been a precise instrument of imperial theology. When the Pantheon was consecrated as a church, the rituals ended, but the architecture remained a silent testimony to the ambitions it once served. Today, as you stand beneath the dome and watch the sun's beam crawl across the ancient marble, you are seeing the last echo of a hidden science. You are witnessing the residue of a system that fused architecture, astronomy, and power into a single blinding phenomenon. The Pantheon was never just a temple. It was a machine for making people believe that Rome's authority was not merely political, but woven into the fabric of the cosmos itself. The next time you visit and lift your gaze to that circular eye in the sky, remember that you are looking into a lens through which emperors shaped the hearts and minds of an empire, one beam of sunlight at a time. Public fountains were used for secret rendezvous. In the grand cities of the Roman Empire, fountains were more than just decoration. They were symbols of civilization, flowing proof that Rome could tame nature and bring water wherever it pleased. These elegant basins stood in plazas and forums, adorned with carved dolphins, gods, and wreaths. They offered refreshment to citizens and travelers alike, and in their constant flow, they reminded everyone who controlled the resources that made life possible. But beneath their polished marble and gurgling water, fountains served another purpose, one far less visible. They became sanctuaries for whispered conspiracies and secret alliances, hiding resistance in the open air. To understand how this was possible, you must first imagine the daily life of a Roman city. People gathered at fountains every hour of the day. Women filled amphorae with fresh water. Children splashed and laughed in the overflow channels. Merchants paused to wash their hands after counting coins. No one questioned why any particular person stood nearby, because everyone came eventually. It was the ideal camouflage. If you were a dissident planning to defy the imperial machine, you could blend into the crowd with a simple gesture. Perhaps you tied your belt a certain way, or wore a sprig of laurel tucked into your sleeve. These signals, meaningless to onlookers, could identify you to another conspirator. Even in the capital itself, where the Praetorian Guard watched every public space, the fountains were impossible to fully monitor. The sounds of the water muffled voices, and the constant bustle of ordinary people created a shield of plausible innocence. If two men spoke briefly and exchanged a folded scrap of wax tablet, no one paid much attention. Rome's underground resistance movements learned to exploit this indifference. Some plotted tax revolts in distant provinces. Others dreamed of restoring the Republic, believing the emperors had corrupted the state beyond redemption. They needed places to meet that would not draw suspicion, and so they turned to the fountains. One of the most famous examples comes from the city of Carthago Nova, where a resistance cell used the central fountain in the forum as their rendezvous point. The fountain's design was simpler, circular basin with 4 spouts feeding into a wide stone trough. During the day, dozens of people visited, and the watchers Rome hired to monitor seditious activity could not see everything. The conspirators worked out a system of timed visits. One man would approach in the late morning, pretend to check the level of the water, and leave a tiny object, a token, a bead, a sliver of pottery on the fountain's edge. Later, another would retrieve it, understanding that the shape and placement of the object conveyed a message. A fragment of blue glass meant the meeting was canceled. A small piece of carved bone indicated it was safe to proceed. When historians unearthed records of these codes, they were astonished by how simple yet effective the system had been. To the authorities, the fountains were public works, points of pride that demonstrated Rome's benevolence. To the rebels, they were neutral ground, places where no one could reasonably be excluded and no gathering could seem too unusual. The layers of daily life became a protective veil. A woman collecting water might carry a message hidden in the folds of her tunic. A child skipping stones across the fountain could be a lookout. and the constant motion of people provided cover for even the most dangerous exchanges. Rome's governors understood, eventually, that fountains could be dangerous precisely because they seemed so harmless. In times of heightened suspicion, patrols were ordered to watch the central fountains and question anyone who lingered too long. But the effect was limited. The sheer number of citizens using these fountains made it impossible to interrogate everyone without inciting panic or resentment, and so the resistance endured. Slipping messages passed Rome's surveillance, hidden by the very openness of these public spaces. Imagine standing beside one of those fountains in the 1st century. The water trickles into the basin. Sunlight glints off the polished stone. Around you, a dozen people go about their business, none of them appearing out of place. But somewhere in that crowd, 2 or 3 are exchanging glances that mean something deadly serious. One may have information about a corrupt magistrate, another may be carrying word of a planned uprising, and neither will ever speak openly. Their entire transaction is a dance of signs, a choreography performed beneath the gaze of an empire. And when they part, they leave no record, only the faint suggestion that something passed between them, unremarkable to any observer. That was the genius of using fountains for clandestine meetings. They were too ordinary to invite scrutiny, too necessary to restrict access, and too public to seem threatening. Over time, Rome's officials learned that no amount of patrols could fully eradicate this hidden network. The water kept flowing, the citizens kept coming, and the conspiracies continued to germinate in the shadows. Long after the empire fell, the practice of using public fountains as rendezvous points survived in medieval cities built on the ruins of Rome. Rebels and spies still favored the fountains, recognizing in them the perfect combination of visibility and secrecy. So the next time you stand beside an ancient fountain, remember that you are standing in a place where history's quietest battles were waged, where power was challenged, not with swords, but with whispered signals and folded scraps of parchment. In the heart of Rome, control was never absolute. The fountains remind us that beneath the surface of civilization, the currents of resistance always find a way to flow. Colosseum lavatories were hidden torture rooms. Imagine yourself standing in the shadow of the Colosseum on a warm Roman morning. All around you, the crowd swells in a restless tide of excitement. Vendors hawk dates and figs, children clamber. Onto marble plinths for a better view, senators arrive flanked by bodyguards. The towering amphitheater looms overhead, its arched corridors alive with the roar of thousands. To most Romans, this was the supreme spectacle, the place where imperial power proved itself through orchestrated brutality. Gladiatorial combat, exotic beasts tearing condemned men apart, public executions made into theater. But there is another lesser-known story, woven into the very stones of this Plysa story, that begins not in the blazing sun of the arena, but in the dim, fetid spaces beneath the public latrines. At first glance, the lavatories of the Colosseum looked perfectly ordinary. Like most Roman public facilities, they were built with remarkable engineering. Rows of marble seats, smooth channels of flowing water to rinse away waste, and a constant circulation of air to keep the smell from overwhelming the crowds. They were designed for efficiency and cleanliness in a city obsessed with order. But hidden behind and beneath some of these restrooms were rooms with a very different purpose. These were narrow chambers with low ceilings and iron fittings set into the wall spaces, built not for sanitation but for interrogation. Records from the late 1st century CE describe how prisoners, especially those accused of crimes against the state, were sometimes taken to these rooms before being sent into the arena. The official purpose was to extract confessions or information about accomplices, but in reality, these interrogations were often a prelude to public execution, ensuring that no last-minute revelations would embarrass the authorities or undermine the show of Roman justice. Imagine a condemned man being led into one of these hidden rooms. He would have already been weakened by days in a holding cell beneath the amphitheater, cold, sleepless, half-starved. He might have been a runaway slave accused of rebellion, or a political dissident whose seditious words had angered a senator. The guards would march him past the latrines, just close enough that he could hear the oblivious laughter of spectators relieving themselves, and then through a concealed doorway into darkness. The rooms themselves were simple but chilling. In their detail, stone benches lined the walls. their surfaces scored with grooves that once held restraints. Iron rings dangled from low arches, designed to bind wrists overhead so the prisoner could be left standing for hours. Some chambers were outfitted with narrow drainage channels, proof that whatever happened there, the evidence could be washed. Away with a bucket of water, torches and wall brackets left soot stains that can still be seen today, blackening the vaults in ragged patterns like scars. Once inside, the prisoner would be forced to stand or kneel as interrogators questioned him. The methods were not sophisticated. Blunt instruments, heated rods, short lengths of chain used to lash the back until blood pooled on the flagstones. The purpose was never merely to punish it, was to break the will, to force names and admissions that would justify the sentence to come. Because in Rome, no public execution was complete without a veneer of legal correctness. The crowd wanted the assurance that the condemned deserved what they were about to suffer. When the questioning was done, whether the prisoner talked or not, the same hidden channels allowed the room to be cleaned. The floor would be sluiced, the blood diluted, and carried away into the sewer system that served the latrines. By the time the next prisoner was brought in, the space looked almost ordinary again. Just another functional chamber beneath the colossal machine of Roman entertainment. This hidden dimension of the Colosseum is almost never mentioned in popular accounts. Guides tell visitors about the trapdoors that released animals into the arena, about the elevators that lifted gladiators to the sand, about the ingenious system of awnings that shaded the upper tiers. But few speak of the rooms behind the lavatories because they reveal something that many prefer to forget. The empire's taste for spectacle was matched by an equally meticulous capacity for unseen cruelty. It was no accident that these rooms were placed where they were. The proximity to the latrines was practical running water, drainage channels, and easy access to the service corridors that threaded through the substructure. But it was also symbolic. In a society where public honor was everything, the process of interrogation was hidden among the filth, deliberately out of sight. The Romans could celebrate justice in the arena above, never troubling themselves with the sordid reality beneath their feet, and yet, for all their efforts to conceal it, the evidence survives. Ancient graffiti scratched into the walls, pleas for mercy. Curses against the guards, fragments of names bear witness to the thousands who passed through those rooms. Archaeologists have found shackles corroded into the masonry, bits of pottery, and iron tools left where they fell. Even the drains tell a story, carrying away more than waste. They carried away the last traces of suffering, so the sands above could remain a place of clean, sanctioned violence. Imagine the moment when a prisoner emerged from that hidden chamber, bruised and broken, blinking in the torchlight. He would be marched up a ramp to the holding pens, given a final cup of water perhaps, his first in hours, and then pushed through the gates into the arena. The crowd would roar, seeing only a condemned criminal. They could not know that just minutes earlier, that man's cries had echoed through a secret room behind the lavatories they themselves had used. This is the unsettling truth of the Colosseum. Its grandeur was never separate from its savagery. The same engineering brilliance that made it the wonder of the ancient world also enabled it to process human lives with ruthless efficiency. Above, the masses were entertained. Below, the empire secured its power by silencing anyone who dared to resist it. And when the day's spectacles ended, the hidden rooms were washed clean, ready to begin again. Even now, when you walk through those passages, you can feel the chill of that legacy. The stones remember what the empire tried so hard to hide. In the end, the Colosseum was not only a monument to Roman ambition, but a testament to how fully a society can normalize cruelty when it is wrapped in ceremony and spectacle. For every triumphant cheer that rang out in the arena, there was an echo underground, a whisper of suffering carried away through the drains, as invisible as it was, inescapable. Senate chambers had trap tiles for emergency escape. When you picture the Roman Senate, you might imagine a place of solemn debate where the most powerful men in the ancient world gathered to shape history. The Curia Julia, the Grand Hall, under Julius Caesar and finished by Augustus, was a space of prestige and authority. Its polished marble floors gleamed in the light that filtered through the high windows. Every surface was designed to impress: the carved cornices, the inlaid panels of exotic stone, the vast open chamber where senators assembled to deliberate the fate of nations. But behind the grandeur lay a hidden architecture of fear and caution. Beneath those immaculate floors, the Senate prepared for moments when words would fail and survival would depend on swiftness and deception. They installed something few outsiders ever knew existed: trap tiles. These seemingly ordinary slabs of marble were designed to conceal emergency exits, passages that could spirit a senator away if the chamber descended into chaos. Imagine standing on the Senate floor, feeling the cool smoothness of the tile beneath your sandals. To the untrained eye, nothing looked unusual. The lines between tiles were perfect. No visible hinges or seams betrayed the secret. But for those who knew, there were subtle cues of faint discoloration along one edge. A difference in how the tile sounded when tapped, a hairline crack that was not an accident but a marker. A senator in danger could step on the correct spot, applying pressure in just the right way, and the tile would shift. A concealed mechanism beneath the floor would tilt the slab upward or slide it aside, revealing a narrow shaft or stair descending. Into darkness, these exits were not elaborate or comfortable. They were pragmatic solutions to a brutal reality. Riots erupted in Rome with little warning, sometimes sparked by famine, scandal, or military defeat. Even within the Curia, violence was never far away. Senators were attacked by angry mobs or by rivals with knives hidden in their togas. The memory of Julius Caesar's assassination haunted every generation that followed. The trap tiles were a response to that legacy of sudden treachery. They were insurance against the moment when the chamber meant to protect you became your tomb. One account survives from the late 1st century, describing how the tiles were used during an uprising. A faction of the Praetorian Guard, angered by the emperor's broken promises, surrounded the Curia. As panic spread through the chamber, several senators retreated toward the far wall. One of them, according to the historian Suetonius, placed his heel on a particular tile and pressed down the marble, swung aside, revealing a steep stair hidden within the foundation. 2 senators disappeared into the passage, the tile sliding back into place just as soldiers burst through the main door. To the attackers, it was as if the men had vanished into the stone itself. The design of these escape routes combined Roman engineering with a deep understanding of human psychology. Senators needed to feel secure enough to speak their minds, but also needed to know there was always a way out. The hidden exits served both purposes: a silent promise that if everything collapsed, there was still a path to safety. Maintaining these tiles required absolute secrecy. Only a few architects and trusted custodians were permitted to inspect the mechanisms. If the knowledge had spread, enemies could have sabotaged the exits or used them to infiltrate the Curia undetected. Even within the Senate, most members were unaware of exactly how many exits existed or where each passage led. Some ended in cellars beneath nearby basilicas, others opened into the cloisters of temples adjoining the forum. A few connected to the underground service corridors used by workers who maintained Rome's public buildings. To the senators who relied on them, the details mattered less than the assurance that the floor beneath their feet held more than just marble, the possibility of escape. Over time, the existence of trap tiles became part of the whispered lore of Roman politics. Visitors from the provinces marveled at the splendor of the Senate chamber, never suspecting that the very floor could betray their ignorance. When later emperors built new assembly halls, some copied the idea, adding hidden exits beneath ceremonial thresholds and altars. The Roman state was powerful, but it was never truly stable. Ambition, envy, and desperation simmered beneath the surface, and any gathering of powerful men could end in bloodshed. The trap tiles were Rome's concession to that instability, reminder that even in the halls of law, survival sometimes demanded the tools of subterfuge. If you were to stand in the ruins of the Curia today, you would see the restored marble floors, their surfaces smooth and unbroken. But the past leaves traces. Scholars who have studied the site believe some of the tiles in the northwest corner were replacements, set after a collapse or hasty repair. Beneath them, fragments of the old mechanisms remain: corroded pivots, the remnants of counterweights, evidence of ingenuity driven by necessity. It is easy to romanticize the Roman Senate as a place of reason and order, but these hidden exits tell a different story. They reveal a world where every man who rose to power also prepared for the moment he would have to flee, where the marble that symbolized Rome's greatness could, with the right pressure, become an escape hatch into darkness. And so the trap tiles remind us that history's most dignified spaces often hide the machinery of fear. The same floor that bore the footsteps of orators and lawmakers also concealed the means of their flight. In Rome, as in every empire, the architecture of glory was never far from the architecture of survival. Roman baths hid forbidden scrolls in pillars. If you were to step into the grand hall of a Roman bathhouse in the 2nd century CE, your senses would be overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the place. Steam billowed from heated pools that glistened under oil lamps. Mosaics in thousands of colored tiles shimmered across walls and floors, and polished columns rose in symmetrical ranks like the trunks of some petrified forest. Everything about the baths spoke of luxury and order, of the Roman obsession with cleanliness, health, and public life. But behind the marble facades and warm pools, something more subversive flickered. Ideas so dangerous they could cost you your reputation or your life. These ideas were not carried openly in satchels or stored on library shelves. They were hidden in hollow pillar scrolls, slipped into the very bones of the architecture to evade censors and survive the zeal of those who feared any challenge to Roman orthodoxy. Bathhouses were among the most frequented spaces in Rome. They were where merchants negotiated contracts, politicians sought favors, and ordinary citizens gossiped about the latest scandals. This constant bustle was exactly why the baths became unlikely sanctuaries for forbidden knowledge. To the casual visitor, a pillar was simply a column of carved marble or stucco-coated brick supporting the vaulted ceilings. But builders often left a hollow channel within these columns to lighten their weight and allow warm air to circulate. In certain bathhouses, particularly those attached to wealthy patrons' estates or located in provincial cities far from the watchful eyes of Rome, these hollow spaces became secret caches for scrolls that were too provocative to display in any formal archive. Consider the sorts of texts that might be hidden there. Some were treatises on natural philosophy, early experiments with physics, or medicine that contradicted official doctrine. Imagine a scroll describing the atomist theories of Democritus, suggesting that all matter consisted of indivisible particles moving through the void, an idea that many Roman authorities considered atheistic because it undermined the role of divine agency. Other scrolls speculated on celestial mechanics, hinting that the earth itself might be in motion, views that could be branded heretical or subversive. Still, others were political manifestos, smuggled copies of speeches by exiled senators who dared to criticize imperial power. And then there were the more incendiary works pamphlets that called for revolt or recounted in detail the brutal suppression of uprisings in the provinces. Archaeological evidence supports this practice, though much of it is fragmentary. In the ruins of a bath complex near Ostia Antica, excavators discovered the shattered remains of terracotta tubes embedded within columns. Tucked into one of these cavities were fragments of papyrus, blackened by time but still bearing traces of Greek script. Scholars believe the text contained commentaries on Epicurean philosophy, a system that argued pleasure, not piety or duty, was the highest good. In Rome, where the state relied on traditional religious devotion to cement loyalty, such views were a quiet threat. Imagine the moment when a scribe or sympathetic bath attendant, under cover of night, slipped the scrolls into their hiding place. Perhaps he climbed a scaffold, heart pounding, listening for the footsteps of a guard. Perhaps he knew that discovery meant more than disgrace, it meant confiscation of property, imprisonment, or worse. But the alternative was to watch those fragile texts consigned to the flames. For some, the preservation of knowledge was worth any risk. The bath's architecture made this concealment surprisingly practical. Many pillars were faced with polished marble veneers affixed by metal clamps. By removing a panel or loosening the mortars, you could reach the hollow within. When the scrolls were secured, the facing would be reattached so neatly that no trace of tampering remained. In a space filled with dozens of identical columns, no casual observer would ever guess which ones held hidden cargo. And because the baths were open to all social classes, it was easy for conspirators to blend in, carrying out their mission under the guise of routine maintenance or cleaning. The presence of these hidden texts reveals something profound about Roman society. Even at the height of its power, it was a civilization haunted by insecurity. Officially, Rome was confident in its destiny, convinced that it embodied the pinnacle of order and culture. Yet beneath this confidence lay a fear that ideas could spread like a contagion unseen, unstoppable. Of empire, consider too the symbolism of hiding knowledge within the structural columns. A pillar is both support and concealment, a load-bearing, an element that holds the roof aloft while keeping its secrets locked away. In this sense, the architecture itself became a metaphor for Roman life. Public virtue propped up private ambition. Civic duty masked private doubt. And beneath the ceremonies of piety and conquest, there were always ideas waiting to surface, ready to question the official narrative. Some of these scrolls likely survived longer than the regimes that condemned them. When barbarian incursions shattered Rome's control over its provinces, bathhouses fell into disrepair. Columns cracked and collapsed. In those moments, the hidden scrolls sometimes tumbled into open air, rediscovered by chance. The Visigoths and Vandals who pillaged Roman cities likely had no idea that among the marble shards were fragile voices from centuries. Past voices that whispered of alternate worlds, of hidden truths, of revolutions that never came. Even as Christianity swept across the empire and bathhouses were stripped of their pagan associations, the practice of hiding texts did not disappear. Some of the earliest Christian communities, persecuted by imperial decree, adapted the same techniques to conceal gospels and epistles. A strategy born of philosophical rebellion was repurposed to shelter religious dissent. In this way, the hollow columns became the last refuge of thought itself an unlikely testament to the persistence of human curiosity and conviction. Today, if you walk through the ruins of a Roman bath and run your hand along the cold curve of a pillar, you are touching more than stone. You are brushing against the invisible history of those who refuse to let their ideas die. You are feeling the silent defiance of scribes and thinkers who trusted that someday someone would break. Open the walls and listen. Their confidence was not misplaced. The scrolls they hid have shaped our understanding of Roman life in ways the emperors could never have predicted. This is the paradox of power. The same structures built to project invincibility can become the hiding places for its undoing. The baths that once symbolized Roman grandeur also sheltered the doubts that would slowly erode it, and the columns that held up ceilings of marble and gold turned out to be the guardians of heresies, philosophies, and dangerous dreams that no empire could ever fully silence. The next time you see a ruin standing serene in the sunlight, remember that inside those walls, ideas once pulsed with quiet urgency, waiting for the moment when history would at last hear their voice. Shrines were used to mask underground prisons. Imagine you are walking along one of the cobbled side streets of ancient Rome as twilight settles over the city. Oil lamps flicker in doorways, casting shifting shadows across the walls. You pass a modest shrine tucked into a recess between two grander buildings, a neat little structure of travertine and painted plaster. Dedicated perhaps to some minor deity whose name never made it into the great epics. The niche glows with candlelight. An offering of fruit sits before a terracotta figure. Everything about it seems ordinary, almost quaint, the sort of civic piety expected from any respectable Roman household or guild. But if you could slip behind that painted wall, you would discover that this shrine was no mere devotional space. Beneath the placid face of the god or goddess, hidden in the gloom, was an entrance to a subterranean chamber built to hold those whose existence the powerful wished to erase. This practice using shrines to mask hidden prisons was no rumor. It was an open secret among Rome's elite, a tool of control as old as the Republic itself. The empire was a civilization obsessed with appearances, the show of legality, the ritual of justice, the illusion that every punishment flowed from some proper law. But when threats arose that could not be dealt with openly rebellious clients, inconvenient witnesses, rivals too slippery to be prosecuted in court, those enemies vanished without official record. And so shrines became the perfect camouflage. Officially, these roadside or courtyard shrines were signs of devotion. They honored household gods, minor spirits, or deified emperors. Many were scrupulously maintained. Fresh flowers, incense, polished stone. To any passerby, they were symbols of piety and stability, public reassurance that Rome's moral order stood intact. But behind these facades, concealed doorways led down narrow staircases or through low tunnels into the earth. The entrances were often ingenious in their simplicity. A votive panel might pivot on a hidden hinge. A low altar could be lifted aside to reveal a descending passage. Some shrines incorporated a false back wall thin enough to break open in a moment of necessity. Once inside, you would find yourself in a small anteroom lined with niches for lamps. From there, a heavy door bronze-bound oak, sealed with iron bolts led into the holding cells themselves. The chambers were nothing like the public prisons, such as the Tullianum, where prisoners awaited formal sentence. These were private spaces unmarked in any ledger. They were just tall enough to stand, just broad enough to pace in 2 steps. There were no windows, only the stale air that seeped through cracks in the stone. The walls were fitted with rings for shackles. Sometimes a small drain was sunk into the floor to carry away filth. No one confined in these rooms was ever meant to be seen again, unless the master of the house decided it. Seneca alludes to these hidden cells obliquely, describing places where the light of day is unwelcome and where the groans of the imprisoned become part of the foundation itself. Pliny the Younger, in one of his letters, hints that a neighbor's shrine might conceal what no law would sanction but every authority would tolerate. Even Tacitus, whose histories often strip away. Rome's pretenses remarked that the houses of the powerful held more captives in secret than the state held in chains. Imagine what it must have felt like to be seized and dragged into such a place. Perhaps it happened in the dead of night-hooded figures entering a sleeping house, the whisper of sandals on tile, a rough hand jerking you awake. You are marched through the courtyard, past the shrine that you might have walked by 100 times without suspicion. The small lamp glows serenely beside the painted figure of some household god. The moment your captors shift the altar aside, the illusion dissolves. You see the darkness gaping below, smell the damp chill rising from the stairway, and understand that your life has passed beyond the reach of any appeal or witness. Those shrines were chosen precisely because no one questioned them. A senator could hold a rival or an informer for days, weeks, or longer, waiting until their spirit broke or until some political arrangement made them expendable. Some prisoners were quietly executed, their bodies smuggled out before dawn. Others were simply released when it was judged safe, dazed, and half-mad, with no idea how many days had passed. Their stories rarely survived. Rome was a society where losing your place in the public record was almost as final as death. Archaeological excavations have confirmed that beneath many surviving dumas, there are rooms that fit this description, windowless, carefully hidden, connected by passages to modest-looking shrines. In some cases, faint graffiti scratched into the plaster remains, names, tally marks, pleas to unknown gods. Tools were found that could be used for both restraint and interrogation. A corroded lamp ringed with soot, a length of chain fused to the wall by centuries of moisture. These small artifacts are all that is left of the thousands who disappeared beneath the shrines. Why did Rome tolerate such practices? Because, in a society that prized order above all, sometimes order required the suspension of law itself. The shrines reassured the neighbors that all was well, that the household was devout and respectable. The hidden cells ensured that any threat could be neutralized without trial, without rumor, without consequence. Together, they formed a perfect system, piety above, terror below. When you visit the ruins of Rome today, you will still see many. Small shrines along old roads and alley-simple niches, carved in stone, figures whose faces have been worn blank by time. You will see nothing in their appearance to suggest what lay behind them. And yet, if you stand very still, if you imagine the city as it was, you might feel a chill in the air, a memory of the countless footsteps that passed by, unaware, while, just a few paces away, someone waited in darkness for a judgment that never came. This is the hidden history of Rome, not just a city of law and architecture and spectacle, but a city where power perfected the art of disappearance, where shrines to the gods became masks for cruelty, where an empire that claimed to bring civilization to the world also taught that the simplest way to destroy a life was to hide it away, beneath a symbol of faith, and never speak its name again. Laundry houses were smuggling hubs in the sprawling neighborhoods of ancient Rome. The Folonica was a fixture of daily life. These laundry shops bustled with activity from dawn until dusk, Workers hauled in baskets, overflowing with stained tunics, woolen cloaks, and linens soaked in the sweat and grime of an empire. Customers came and went, bringing the spoils of trade and the residue of labor to be scrubbed away. From the outside, a Follonica seemed like the last place anyone would look for subversion. The air smelled of lye and ammonia. The floors were slick with soapy runoff. But beneath the steaming vats and drying racks, many Folonicae became unexpected hubs of smuggling, hiding contraband in plain sight. To understand how this was possible, you must first imagine the layout. A typical Roman laundry was a labyrinth of chambers and basins. Workers soaked fabrics in large tubs filled with water, urine, and special clays to remove stains. They trampled the cloth underfoot, wrung it out, rinsed it, and laid it across stone counters to dry. In the rear, enormous jars stored supplies, alkaline powders, pigments, and sometimes secret cargo. The constant motion and heavy odors made close inspection difficult. Officials tasked with searching for banned items rarely stayed long. For smugglers, this was the perfect environment. One of the most common contraband items was forbidden literature. Scrolls that criticized the emperor or questioned Roman religion. A seditious manuscript could destroy careers or incite revolt. Transporting such texts was dangerous, but a Follonica could wrap them in layers of linen, damp and unremarkable, and move them from one part of the city to another without drawing a glance. A delivery cart piled high with folded tunics looked no different whether it concealed clean, laundry, or subversive words. Gold was also smuggled this way, hidden in the false bottoms of storage urns. A jar that appeared to hold soap powder could, in fact, conceal coins intended for bribery or the funding of uprisings. The foolers themselves often profited from this trade, taking a percentage of the value in exchange for their silence and cooperation. In the chaos of Roman politics, alliances shifted constantly. A senator in disgrace might try to spirit his wealth out of the city before confiscation. A freedman, hoping to buy influence, could use the laundry network to hide payments. Even escaped. Slaves sometimes vanished into the system, concealed under heaps of damp linen. One of the most remarkable accounts comes from the city of Pompeii. Archaeologists excavating a well-preserved Follonica uncovered a set of sealed amphorae hidden behind a false wall. Inside, they found not cleaning agents, but small bundles of parchment, carefully wrapped in waxed cloth to protect them from moisture. The texts were fragmentary, but some appeared to be treatises on republican governance ideas considered dangerous under imperial rule. This discovery confirmed what some historians had long suspected. Folonicae were more than humble laundries. They were conduits of forbidden knowledge. The workers who toiled there were often slaves or freedmen, people on the margins of society. Accustomed to navigating Rome's invisible boundaries, they learned to keep secrets because their survival depended on discretion. The foolers developed elaborate signals to communicate when it was safe to move contraband. A white cloth hung in a doorway might mean the path was clear. A blue ribbon tied to a cart's handle could signal caution. These silent codes flowed alongside the legitimate business, hidden by the very banality of the work. Imagine standing in one of these laundries at the height of the empire. You would hear the slap of wet fabric on stone, the low murmur of voices, the hiss of boiling vats. You might see a cart rolling past, piled high with clean togas. But what you would not see, what you were never meant to see, was the packet of letters tucked beneath the cloth, or the gold coins hidden in the carts. False floor. Rome prided itself on order and control. Yet it was this same obsession with appearances that made the Follonica the ideal smuggling hub. No one wanted to look too closely at the place where the city's dirty laundry was laid bare. No one wanted to stand too long in the acrid air. The system thrived on this reluctance. Even when suspicions arose, proving anything was nearly impossible, the contraband moved quickly, transferred from one laundry to another, passed from cart to cart until it reached its destination. By then, the trail had gone cold. Over time, the empire's enforcers learned that brute force rarely worked against this network. Raids produced little evidence because the foolers always seemed to know in advance. Informants disappeared or turned out to be working for multiple masters. The laundry houses taught a simple lesson. In Rome, power did not reside only in marble, palaces, and military legions. It also lived in the quiet places, where ordinary people performed humble work, while deciding which secrets would remain hidden. Long after the empire fell, the practice continued. Medieval laundries inherited some of the same techniques, using cloth to shield contraband from prying eyes. Today, the ruins of Roman Phalanike stand in silent testimony to a world where washing a tunic could be an act of defiance, and where the simple motion of folding linen could conceal revolutions in the making. The clean smell of soap and steam was a disguise, a layer of innocence that hid the restless currents beneath. And in that contrast, we see Rome's true nature, a civilization of dazzling surfaces and hidden depths that even the emperor could not fully command. Granite floors hid listening devices. Literally imagine walking across the polished granite floors of a Roman administrative building at twilight. You would feel the reassuring solidity beneath your sandals, the cold perfection of stone quarried from distant mountains, cut with almost obsessive precision. The floor gleamed under flickering lamplight, a silent testament to imperial power and architectural mastery. But you would have no idea that beneath your feet, the floor was not entirely what it seemed. For certain government complexes, those concerned with intelligence, tax collection, or the distribution of grain, granite was not the only material layered into the surface. Hidden beneath some of those tiles were thin sheets of hammered bronze designed to catch and transmit the smallest tremors. Each footstep resonated through the plates like a distant drumbeat. In this way, the floor itself became a primitive listening device, a surveillance tool crafted with such subtlety that even the men who walked upon it never suspected. To understand how this astonishing system evolved, you must first appreciate the Roman obsession with control. The empire's administrative machinery depended on the accurate flow of information. From the forum to the provinces, governors sent dispatches, collected taxes, and enforced the emperor's edicts. Yet Rome was also a culture of intrigue, where alliances shifted as quickly as the tide, and conspiracies thrived behind closed doors. During the 1st century CE, under emperors such as Tiberius and Domitian, fear of sedition became almost pathological. Senate records and private correspondence describe the lengths to which the state would go to uncover dissent. Informers, known as delatores, operated openly, encouraged by financial rewards and imperial favor. But in addition to these human agents, the Romans began experimenting with architectural strategist ways of making buildings themselves instruments of intelligence gathering. One of the most extraordinary tactics involved the floors. Historical fragments and the work of later chroniclers such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio hint at this practice, though they never describe it outright. A handful of archaeological discoveries have corroborated their hints. Floors where large granite tiles were removed and replaced with thinner stone slabs laid over bronze membranes. These bronze sheets acted much like the skin of a drum, vibrating. With every movement above them, the effect was twofold. First, it amplified footfalls so that guards stationed in adjacent rooms could literally feel how many people were present after hours. Second, it allowed trained listeners to recognize patterns of movements. Slow, cautious steps suggested secrecy. Quick, erratic footsteps hinted at panic. If anyone tried to gather in the dead of night to plot treason or manipulate records, the floor would betray them. Imagine the psychology of working in such a place. You might be a scribe, tasked with transcribing legal decrees late into the evening. Perhaps you believed you were alone, safe in the silence of the archives. But behind the walls, in a hidden chamber or narrow service corridor, a pair of sentries pressed their palms to a bronze panel connected to the floor plates. They could feel your every step. They might have a wax tablet ready to record the time you moved, how long you paused, whether you lingered by the locked chests where sensitive scrolls were stored. The practice was not common in every government building. It was expensive, requiring engineers to lift and relay large sections of flooring. But in structures that held the archives of tax rolls, grain allotment records, and intelligence reports, this level of security was justified. The Roman economy depended on these records. So did the careers of countless senators and administrators who would stop at nothing to ensure their rivals did not tamper with them. There are even suggestions that some of these bronze plates were linked to simple mechanical alarm weights balanced on delicately tensioned rods, which would topple if the vibrations exceeded a certain threshold. The resulting noise was enough to alert guards stationed nearby. While no surviving example of such an alarm has been conclusively identified, the writings of a 4th century engineer named Vitruvius Minor allude to balancing devices beneath bronze skins in certain state offices. Consider, too, the symbolism of such a floor. To an outsider, the smooth granite tiles were simply a mark of prestige. To those who knew their true function, they were a constant reminder that the empire trusted no one completely. Every meeting, every conversation was potentially suspect. The building itself had ears, and if the floors could hear you, the walls might be listening too. Stories circulated among clerks and junior officials about careers ended by a single suspicious footstep. One tale describes a minor functionary who lingered too long near the records of grain shipments. He had no intention of stealing or altering documents, but his hesitation was interpreted as proof of conspiracy. He vanished from public life soon afterward, his name never again recorded in official rolls. Whether the story was true or invented to keep employees in line hardly mattered. Fear was a tool as effective as any bronze plate. Even after the empire fractured, some of these buildings survived, their strange floors intact beneath layers of dust and debris. Medieval chroniclers who stumbled upon them puzzled over the thin metal membranes, unable to imagine their purpose. Some speculated they were remnants of pagan rituals or the supports for vanished statues. Only modern archaeological analysis has begun to reveal the truth, that these silent instruments were as much a part of Rome's intelligence apparatus as the delatores who whispered in the corridors of the Palatine Hill. When you walk through the ruins of Rome today, it is easy to be seduced by the grandeur of what remains: soaring arches, colossal domes, intricate mosaics. But if you look down and study the floors, you may glimpse a subtler form of power. These were surfaces built not only to impress but to surveil. They were the empire's quietest sentinels, listening even when no human ear was present. This is what makes the legacy of Rome so unsettling. The same civilization that produced sublime poetry and breathtaking architecture also perfected the art of suspicion. They turned their buildings into conspirators, their floors into accomplices. And they proved that the most effective surveillance is the kind you never see coming. The next time you find yourself in an ancient hall, running your hand across the cool stone, remember, you are touching more than history. You are feeling the residue of an empire that taught the world how to watch without being seen, and how to listen without ever making a sound. Elite bathhouses had truth pools. Imagine stepping through the polished bronze doorway of an elite Roman bathhouse in the late afternoon. The sun slanting across a mosaic floor so intricate it almost shimmers. The air inside is heavy with warm moisture and the faint aroma of crushed herbs, lavender, bay leaves, and something sharper, more pungent. You might think you have entered a sanctuary of leisure, a place reserved for the privileged to cleanse themselves of the grime of the forum and refresh the mind before an evening banquet. But this place, while it wears the face of luxury, conceals a purpose far darker. Here, in the soft glow of wall lamps and the hushed splash of water over marble ledges, the bathhouse served as a stage for an interrogation that was as cunning as it was cruel. These were the truth pools, baths built not simply to soothe tired muscles, but to weaken resolve, loosen tongues, and extract confessions from men too proud or too cautious to speak under ordinary threat. The Romans understood that pain alone did not always produce useful information. A man in agony might say anything to end his suffering, but if you could blur his senses, if you could dissolve the rigid discipline that held his secrets locked away, then you might coax him to talk of his own accord, half believing he had chosen to unburden himself. This was the genius behind the truth pools. In these private bathhouses, usually annexed to the homes of senators or high magistrates, there were special caldaria, or hot rooms, that included sunken pools lined with smooth stone. At a glance, they looked no different from any other bathing installation. But unlike ordinary baths, these pools were kept at a temperature just high enough to induce lightheadedness and dehydration. The water was steeped with certain herbs and minerals. Some, like rosemary or myrtle, had mild, relaxing effects. Others were more potent, extracts of poppy, nightshade, or datura in carefully measured amounts, enough to dull the mind without rendering a man unconscious. Imagine the scene. The suspect, perhaps a junior officer accused of treasonous correspondence, or a freedman suspected of siphoning funds would be escorted inside under the pretense of reconciliation or negotiation. The host, all soft words and gracious gestures, would explain that no chains were necessary. They were simply here to resolve misunderstandings in private. A cup of warm, spiced wine might be offered another dose of reassurance, laced with a mild sedative. The suspect would be led to the water's edge, encouraged to step in and relax. At first, the experience would be pleasant. The heat sank. Into the bones, the aromatic steam softened tension. Voices blurred in the echoing chamber. But as the minutes passed, the combination of elevated temperature and herbal infusion began to work on the mind. The suspect's thoughts slowed, inhibitions loosened. Perspiration poured from the skin, carrying away the body's balance of fluids. As a light dizziness set in, the host or appointed interrogators would begin to ask questions, always gently, always as if nothing serious were at stake. In that haze, it became harder to maintain the rehearsed denials, the careful half-truths. A man who would never have broken on the rack or under a centurion's lash might begin to volunteer dates, amounts, and all the while, the setting around him reinforced the illusion that he was not a prisoner, but a guest in the sanctuary of Roman refinement. He might even feel grateful for the warmth, for the soft words, for the suggestion that honesty would bring relief. Seneca alluded to such tactics obliquely when he wrote that no instrument of persuasion is more subtle than comfort. When offered in the service of necessity, Pliny the Younger, in a private letter, remarked on an acquaintance who was undone not by torture but by the baths. Though neither named specific houses, archaeological evidence suggests that certain elite villas incorporated caldaria with unusual features drains for rapidly exchanging water, concealed flues to maintain higher than normal temperatures, and storerooms containing amphorae labeled with herbal preparations. Even the design of these bathhouses served the strategy. The walls were curved to magnify sound, carrying the soft interrogations clearly to any listener the host wished to place. Nearby, a hidden scribe might sit in a niche behind a thin partition recording every faltering answer. If the suspect resisted too long, attendants could open vents to let in blasts of hotter air, further sapping his strength. When the confession was complete or when it was judged that nothing more could be gained, the suspect was usually allowed to recover his composure in a cooler room. In some cases, he was permitted to leave with a promise of leniency. In others, he was simply handed over to the lictors for formal arrest. The bathhouse, of course, remained spotless. Just another jewel in the display of patrician hospitality. The Romans understood better than any people before them that power depended not only on force, but on the appearance of civility. What better demonstration than these hidden interrogations in the very places that symbolized Roman luxury and culture? To the outside world, the baths were monuments to refinement and the art of living well. Inside, they were laboratories of psychological manipulation, engineered to turn suspicion into certainty, rumor into evidence. Archaeological excavations at sites like the Villa of the Papyri and elite estates near Pompeii have yielded clues that reinforce the written accounts: unusual residues in drain channels, storerooms with amphorae containing dried herbs known to have sedative or hallucinogenic properties, and caldaria constructed to maintain higher than standard temperatures for extended periods. Though no official inscriptions admit their purpose, the convergence of these findings suggests that the truth pools were real and used more widely than most modern visitors can imagine. If you stood in one of those rooms today, you might notice how the light slants across the water, how the curved walls amplify a whisper. You might catch the faint temps of minerals still embedded in the stone. And if you listen closely, you might almost hear the murmured questions. The faltering answers echoes of the countless men who believed for a moment that they were safe in the embrace of Roman hospitality, only to discover too late that comfort itself can be a cage. This was the genius of Roman power, the ability to make cruelty feel inevitable, even humane. The truth pools were not simply baths or prisons or torture chambers. They were all of these at once an instrument of empire that proved how icily a civilized veneer can conceal the most calculated forms of coercion. And in their quiet, steaming depths, countless secrets were surrendered, dissolved into the water as invisibly as the herbs that made them possible. The cleanest street in Rome led to execution chambers. In the heart of ancient Rome, there was a street so immaculate, so meticulously maintained, that visitors often remarked on its unnatural perfection. This was the Via Tulliana, a short thoroughfare. That cut discreetly between bustling districts and vanished into a quiet curve. It was lined with polished paving stones that glistened after every rainfall, swept so often that not a single piece of refuse dared linger for long. The marble facades along its edges were free of soot and graffiti. Even the beggars avoided it. To the casual observer, the Via Tulliana was a testament to Roman ordura, model of civic pride. But the truth was far darker. The street owed its eerie cleanliness to fear, for at its end stood the Tullianum prison, a place where the empire's enemies disappeared, where sentences were carried out far from the crowds and applause. The Via Tulliana was a funnel that drew the condemned along its pristine stones to the final darkness that waited beneath the Capitoline Hill. Imagine standing there in the early dawn as the first light touched the rooftops. The silence was absolute. While nearby markets already clattered to life, this street seemed to hold its breath. From time to time, small processions would move along its soldiers, escorting a prisoner whose eyes were fixed on the ground. Passersby turned away, unwilling to meet that gaze. Even in an empire accustomed to violence, the Tullianum inspired a special kind of dread. The prison itself was deceptively plain. Above ground, it appeared little more than a squat stone building, unadorned, almost anonymous. But beneath it lay chambers carved into the living rock, cells that had held generations of Rome's most notorious captives. Some were traitors and foreign kings, others were conspirators who had dared to challenge the Senate's authority. Once inside, there was no return to the clean air of the Via Tulliana. The floors below were said to be cold even in high summer. Moisture collected on the walls, and the smell of earth and old blood never truly faded. The most infamous of these spaces was the Tullianum's underground cell, known as the carcer, a low, suffocating chamber accessible only through a hole in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered by rope into its darkness. When the rope was pulled back, the opening was sealed with a heavy stone. Here, death was not delivered with spectacle. It came quietly, whether by strangulation, starvation, or the final blade. Some accounts claimed the executions happened in absolute silence, so the street above remained undisturbed. That silence was the point. Rome knew how to orchestrate public terror, but it also understood the power of invisible fear. The Via Tulliana embodied that strategy perfectly. It was a place where no one shouted, no crowds gathered, no protests dared rise. When the condemned walked its length, they passed no jeering mobs. They passed only the unbroken marble and the knowledge that each step brought them closer to the cell that waited in the depths. Historians believe the street's fastidious upkeep was deliberate. Officials ordered the stones to be scrubbed daily so that no blood or dirt would mar the surface. The message was clear. The empire's justice was clean, controlled, inevitable. There would be no mess for ordinary Romans to contemplate. The horror remained beneath the ground. And so the Via Tulliana became a paradox. It was both a symbol of Rome's civility and a prelude to its darkest impulses. Over centuries, it witnessed countless final walks. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix was dragged along it before his strangulation in the Tullianum. Senators accused of treason stepped over the polished stones, flanked by guards whose faces betrayed no emotion. Even high-born citizens, men whose wealth could buy nearly anything, could not buy their way off that path once judgment had been passed. Imagine the dread that must have gripped each condemned soul as the prison came into view. The narrow windows offered no glimpse of life within. The door stood partly open like the mouth of some patient predator, and behind it, the carcer waited in the dark. The most unsettling part of the journey may have been the perfect quiet. No crowds, no pleading relatives, only the soft echo of footsteps on marble. In that silence, a man was left alone with the certainty of his fate. This ritual was as much psychological as physical. Rome knew that death could be made more terrible by stripping it of noise and spectacle. The Via Tulliana became an instrument of that cruelty, its clean stones reflecting the first rays of daylight, onto faces that would never see the sun again. Even today, the ruins of the Tullianum survive. Tourists descend into the chill darkness, unaware at first that they are retracing the steps of the condemned. They marvel at the engineering, the brickwork, the inscriptions, but some pause, sensing that the place remembers. The walls have absorbed too many final breaths to ever be truly silent. And above, the ancient paving stones of the Via Tulliana still gleam when rain falls. They remain clean, as if no grief ever touched them. But history knows better. It knows that beneath those perfect surfaces lay a hidden machinery of death, and that the cleanest street in Rome led always to the same cold cell. In that contrast between marble and blood, silence and screams swallowed by stone, the empire revealed its true face-on empire that could make even its executions look immaculate.